asked humanity for help. By the time they answered, the galaxy learned fear. The Valorian Dominion had not lost a war in 11,000 years, and Fleet Marshal Threxus Val intended to keep it that way, with the same effort he spent breathing. From the command throne of the dreadnought Ashes of Kelmar, he watched the tactical plot bloom above him like a slow, obedient flower. 412 warships unfolding out of hyperspace, in a formation so perfect it looked less like a fleet and more like a diagram in a textbook. The kind Valorian cadets memorized before they ever set foot on a real bridge. Behind the dreadnought came the battle cruisers, hulls the color of dried blood, each one 3 kilometers of layered ceramic composite armor wrapped around graviton cannons that had cracked open the crust of 100 worlds. Behind them, the troop carriers, bulbous and patient, holding 2 million soldiers who had never once needed to disembark before the enemy below had already raised the white flag. This was not an invasion fleet. This was a formality with guns. The Dominion had built its entire military philosophy around a single, unbroken truth, repeated in every war college classroom from Kelmar Prime to the outer annex worlds. Overwhelming, undeniable presence ended wars before they began. A species shown the true scale of Valorian power, the crown formations, the mile-long shadows cast across a planet's daylight side, the sheer, patient confidence of a fleet that had never once needed to fire a shot in genuine anger to secure a surrender. Simply understood, in whatever primitive part of its brain still remembered being prey. That resistance changed nothing except how much of its population survived to be annexed. 11,000 years of that doctrine had produced a military culture almost entirely unfamiliar with the concept of genuine surprise. Dominion warships were built enormous, over-armored, and centrally commanded, because they had never needed to be built any other way. There had never been an enemy capable of making agility, decentralization, or economy of force matter more than raw, overwhelming mass. The battle cruisers escorting the Ashes of Kelmar that day carried names meant to be recited like scripture. The Talon of Rinkai, the Second Providence, the Undying Question, each one a floating monument to a war some previous generation of Valorians had already won so thoroughly that the enemy in question no longer existed as a distinct culture. Its worlds folded quietly into the Dominion's ever-expanding administrative maps. Humanity's warships, by contrast, had been built by a species with an entirely different relationship to loss. Every human colony beyond the solar system had been founded, at some level, by people who understood that help, if it ever came, would come too late, and that the difference between survival and extinction would therefore have to be manufactured locally, cheaply, and redundantly, because no navy back home could be relied upon to arrive before the crisis was already over. That philosophy had produced a doctrine almost the mirror opposite of the Dominion's, distributed rather than centralized, disposable rather than monumental, built around the assumption that any single ship, however capable, would eventually be lost, and that the fleet as a whole needed to be able to absorb that loss without losing coherence. It was, in its own quiet way, a doctrine built entirely out of fear. Fear of exactly the kind of overwhelming, unstoppable force now settling into orbit above Meridian's rest. And fear, when it is given 6 years and enough patience, has a way of building things that confidence never bothers to imagine. Threxus allowed himself a small, satisfied breath as the system resolved on the plot. A single yellow star, 4 rocky worlds, 1 gas giant the color of a healing bruise, and orbiting the 3rd planet, a scattering of human structures so thin and so poorly shielded that his sensor officers had almost apologized for how little there was to report. The world was called in the clumsy human tongue Meridian's Rest. Population, an estimated 110,000. Military presence, negligible. The Dominion's own intelligence codex, compiled from 3 separate long-range survey drones over the past standard year, had stamped the species designation with a single damning line, Class 5 minimal threat. Recommend standard annexation protocol. Expect surrender within 1 standard day of first contact. They have not even bothered to camouflage their comm towers, said Submarshal Edith Core, standing at Threxus's left with her hands clasped behind her back in the posture of a woman who had already begun composing her victory report. Look at the resolution on this, Marshal. Their shipyard, if you can call it that, has a civilian registry beacon broadcasting in the clear. They are not even trying to hide. Humans, Threxus said, the word raw. Ling off his mandibles with the particular contempt the dominion reserved for species too young to have learned humility properly, are a curiosity. Aggressive in their own tiny wars, yes. Clever with chemistry and information systems, yes. But strategically. He gestured at the plot with 2 fingers, a dismissive flick that had ended the careers of subordinates who displeased him. Children playing with fire in a house they do not understand is made of paper. He was not entirely wrong about the fire. He was catastrophically wrong about the paper. What the Dominion survey drones had recorded as a civilian comm tower cluster orbiting Meridian's Rest was, in fact, 6 autonomous orbital defense platforms built inside decommissioned agricultural satellite hulls, their true nature buried under 3 meters of scrap plating, false thermal signatures, and a broadcast profile deliberately engineered by human intelligence analysts to read as boring, outdated, and harmless. What the drones had logged as a modest shipyard servicing local mining traffic was a forward staging and repair depot for a fleet that did not yet officially exist in any diplomatic database in known space. And what no drone, no listening post, and no long-range sensor sweep had detected at all, because it had been built specifically not to be detected, was the reason Meridian's Rest had been settled in this particular system, at this particular distance from a particular gas giant, in the first place. The gas giant was called Threshold by the 700 people who knew what was hidden behind it, and by no one else. Its magnetic field was monstrous, roiling with radiation storms that scrambled sensor returns for 11 million kilometers in every direction. The kind of environment that made most spacefaring species simply route their survey patterns around it and note the system as geologically unremarkable, gas giant unsuitable for colonization. The humans of Meridian's Rest had looked at that same radiation-soaked graveyard of a planet and seen something else entirely. A wall nobody could see through, behind which you could hide anything you wanted, for as long as you wanted, provided you were patient enough and paranoid enough to build it right. Humanity, as a species, had never been accused of lacking patience for grudges or imagination for paranoia. Behind Threshold's churning storm bands, in an orbit so tight to the gas giant's own ring debris that from any outside angle the ship simply read as more rock, sat the 9th Colonial Response Fleet, 61 vessels that did not exist on any Dominion star chart, built from hulls coated in radar-absorbent ceramics and running heat-sink architecture that bled their thermal signature slowly into cold-sink plates rather than venting it where anyone could see. They had been stationed there for 6 years, 4 months, and 11 days, waiting for exactly this. Not because Meridian's Rest Command had known the Valorian Dominion by name. They had known, with the flat certainty of people who had already survived 2 smaller first-contact wars against other empires and buried the dead from both, that eventually, someone big and confident and old would come looking at a lightly defended human colony and see an easy meal. The trap had not been built for the Dominion specifically. It had been built for exactly this kind of arrogance, whoever wore it. Fleet Admiral Renata Osei commanded the 9th from the flag bridge of the carrier Kestrel's Vow, a ship whose hull plating had been aged and weathered on purpose, streaked with faux carbon scoring to make it look, to any casual sensor pass, like a 40-year-old mining hauler slowly rusting into the gas giant's orbit. She was 53 years old, silver-haired, and had not raised her voice in a command briefing in over a decade, because she had found, across 3 wars, that people listened more carefully to a quiet voice than a loud one. She stood now with both hands flat on the tactical rail, watching the same system plot the Valorian marshal was watching, 4 light-minutes away and utterly invisible to him, and she felt nothing that could be called excitement. She felt the particular, cold clarity of a woman watching a plan she had rehearsed 1,100 times in simulation finally begin to breathe on its own. "Confirm passive tracking on the Dominion formation," she said. "Confirmed, Admiral," replied Commander Elias Brandt from the sensor station, his voice steady despite the fact that his hands out of Osai's sightline were not quite steady at all. 412 hulls, 1 dreadnought class, designation unknown, approximately 6 kilometers keel to keel, 91 battle cruisers, the rest reads as troop and logistics tonnage. He paused, scrolling through the passive returns a second time, because the number felt like it deserved a second look. "Admiral, that's the largest single hostile formation this command has ever tried." "Seeked." "I'm aware," Osa said, and there was nothing in her tone that suggested this changed anything about the morning's plan. "Colony authority. Governor Ape is standing by. He knows his lines." "Good. Let them come to the table first." Arrogant men always want to hear themselves explain the surrender terms before they bother listening to whether anyone's agreeing. 4 light-minutes away, Threxus Vol was already composing exactly the kind of speech Osa had predicted. The ashes of Kelmer dropped out of its approach vector into a stable orbit 60,000 kilometers above Meridian's rest, and the rest of the Dominion fleet arranged itself around the dreadnought in the same textbook formation, a slow-rotating crown of warships that blotted out a measurable fraction of the system's starlight. Threxus opened a wideband communication channel down to the colony's civilian government. The same channel his intelligence officers had confirmed was the colony's only working long-range transmitter, according to 3 separate surveillance passes, and allowed the translation matrix a full 2 seconds to calibrate to whatever crude dialect these humans used before he spoke. "This is Fleet Marshal Threxus Vol of the Valorian Dominion, First Blade of the 17th Armada, addressing the colonial authority of the world designated Meridian's Rest." He let the silence stretch a moment, the way he always did, so that the weight of 400 warships hanging in their sky might sink properly into whatever passed for these creatures' understanding of consequence. "Your world has been surveyed and catalogued. Your species has been classified. You possess no fleet capable of contesting Dominion space, no defensive infrastructure capable of resisting orbital bombardment, and no strategic value sufficient to justify resistance. I offer you the same terms the Dominion has offered 11,000 years of worlds before yours. Submit to annexation, surrender your planetary defense codes, and your people will be integrated as a protected labor class within the Dominion's territory. Refuse, and I will reduce every structure on your surface to slag and begin again with whoever crawls out of the rubble willing to negotiate. You have 1 hour. On the surface, in a government building that had been deliberately built to look older and shabbier than its actual reinforced substructure, Colonial Governor Quame Ake sat behind a desk with his hands folded, watched by a room of people who all already knew how this conversation was supposed to go, and did exactly what 6 years of planning told him to do. He panicked beautifully on camera. "Marshal, Fleet Marshal, please. We are a civilian settlement. We have no military capacity of any kind. We—" His voice cracked exactly where Osai's staff had coached him to let it crack. "We cannot possibly resist a force of this size. We ask only for time to consult with our population before." "You have 1 hour," Threxus repeated, and cut the channel, already turning to Eeth Core with the bored satisfaction of a man watching a script play out precisely as written. "They will beg for terms within the hour. They always do. Ready the boarding shuttles. I want the first labor processing teams on the surface by evening." What Threxus did not know, what no Dominion sensor sweep, no long-range drone, no intercepted transmission had ever told him, because the humans of Meridian's Rest had spent 6 years making absolutely certain of it, was that the civilian government building, broadcasting Governor Ape's frightened negotiation, was itself sitting directly above the primary fire control node for all 6 orbital defense platforms, and that the trembling in the governor's voice was the only part of the performance that wasn't, strictly speaking, an act. He was frightened. Everyone on that planet was frightened. Fear did not mean they hadn't already decided, 6 years ago, exactly what they were going to do about 400 alien warships showing up in their sky. The hour passed. Threxus Vol did not spend it worrying. He spent it reviewing labor allocation projections for the colony's mining operations with the mild, satisfied boredom of a man doing paperwork he had done 11,000 times before, while behind threshold storm-racked cloud bands, 61 human warships ran final weapons checks in total electromagnetic silence, and in orbit around Meridian's Rest itself, 6 civilian communication satellites quietly rotated their disguised launch bays a few careful degrees, tracking targets they had already been tracking, patiently, since the moment the Dominion fleet dropped out of hyperspace. At the 59-minute mark, Governor Ape opened the channel again, and this time his voice did not crack. It was flat and very calm, and it said something that Threxus Vol's translation matrix rendered roughly as, "Marshal Vol, on behalf of the people of Meridian's Rest, I.H. Ave consulted with our authorities. Our answer is no." For a full 2 seconds, on the bridge of the ashes of Kelmer, nobody spoke, because the concept of a Class 5 minimal threat declining terms had simply never occurred to anyone in the room as something that needed a contingency plan. Threxus felt something close to genuine amusement. "No," he repeated, tasting the absurdity of the word. "Submartial Corps, begin bombardment sequencing on the primary population center. Non-lethal ordnance first. I want them frightened, not exterminated. We still require the labor. Prepare a second hail once the first strike has landed. I expect their tone to improve considerably." Marshal Corps began and stopped herself, because questioning an order in front of the bridge crew was not how a sub-marshal advanced in the Dominion's officer corps. "Speak," Threxus said, mildly irritated. "Sensor telemetry, Marshal. There's a—" She frowned at her own console, a small crease of confusion crossing a face trained for 11,000 years of predictable wars. "A power signature spike from 3 of the orbital comm platforms. It's minor. Could be a fault in their equipment." "It is a fault in their equipment," Threxus said, already turning back to the tactical plot. "Because it is a comm satellite, sub-marshal and comm satellites do not have weapons, because this is a Class 5 world, and Class 5 worlds have nothing behind their sad little transmitters except sad little transmitters. Begin the bombardment sequence." The order that followed was the last order Threxus Vol gave that day that unfolded the way he expected. The moment the ashes of Kelmer's forward battery began charging its bombardment lance, a graviton compression weapon capable of stripping a city block down to bedrock in a single pulse, the 6 civilian communication satellites in orbit around Meridian's Rest finished the rotation they had begun 59 minutes earlier, shed their outer scrap plating in 6 near-simultaneous explosive bolts, and revealed themselves as what they had actually been built to be. Prometheus-class orbital defense platforms, each one mounting a single electromagnetic coilgun rail 200 meters long, charged for 6 years on slow-bleed reactor cores specifically so that at the moment they were needed, they would already be sitting at full capacity, requiring no telltale power spike to give away the ambush a second before it fired. 6 platforms, patient as tombstones, had spent 6 years disguised as the most boring objects in the sky, and in the space between one breath and the next, they stopped being boring forever. There was no warning shot. There was no hail. The 6 platforms fired within 400 milliseconds of each other. 6 slugs of depleted collapsed matter alloy, each one the mass of a small ground car, accelerated to 9% of light speed down a magnetic rail that had been silently tracking the ashes of Kelmer's hull, the entire time Threxus Vol had been composing his victory speech. Kinetic weapons do not care about a target's diplomatic classification. They do not care about 11,000 years of unbroken military history. 4 of the 6 slugs struck the dreadnought amidships, and at that velocity, the impact did not look like an explosion so much as a violation of the ship's basic right to continue existing as a single object. Armor, structural bulkheads, internal decking, and several hundred Valorian crew converted, in the space of a heartbeat, into a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated debris punching clean through the far side of the hull and out into vacuum. The ashes of Kelmer, 6 kilometers of the Dominion's most storied warship, staggered in its own orbit like a struck animal, its forward third venting atmosphere and wreckage in a glittering tail that would have been beautiful if it hadn't represented 11,000 human and 11,000, and Valorian deaths compressed into 4 seconds. On the bridge, alarms that had never once needed to sound in Threxus Vol's entire command career screamed all at once. He was thrown against his restraint harness hard enough to crack 2 ribs, and through the smoke and the sudden screaming of damage control klaxons, he heard Eth Corps' voice, no longer composing victory reports, shouting numbers that made no sense to a man who had been told, with total confidence, that this world had nothing. Hull breach decks 4 through 11. We've lost forward graviton battery. We've lost secondary shield generation, Marshal. That was a kinetic strike. That was a rail weapon from a comm satellite. Return fire, Threxus roared, ribs grinding, the amusement of 30 seconds ago replaced by something he had almost forgotten the shape of. Alarm. All batteries, target those platforms, I want them. He never finished the sentence, because that was the moment the rest of Meridian's Rest's defenses stopped being patient. Behind Threshold Store, M-lashed cloud bands, 61 kilometers of accumulated human warship tonnage that had been sitting in radiation-shrouded silence for 6 years, finally lit their engines, and the 9th Colonial Response Fleet surged out from behind the gas giant in a formation that had nothing in common with the Dominion's parade ground crown. Admiral Osai's ships came in staggered, layered, spread across 3-dimensional space in overlapping fire lanes designed by officers who had spent their careers assuming they would always be outnumbered and outgunned, and who had therefore built a doctrine that did not require numerical parity to win. At the front of the formation ran the light strike carriers, 12 of them, and from their launch bays poured the first wave of what Dominion sensor logs would later. Those logs that survived simply label swarm designation unknown. 11,000 autonomous combat drones, each one barely larger than a human being, cheap, fast, expendable, and networked into a single distributed targeting intelligence that could recalculate an entire engagement's fire solution 11 times a second. They did not fly in formation. They flowed, a glittering, chaotic storm of thrust flares that no point defense system built to intercept a dozen incoming missiles had ever been designed to filter out of the noise, because there was no way to filter out 11,000 simultaneous small threats without simply running out of tracking channels first. Threxus Vol, blood running from a cut above his brow ridge, staring at a tactical plot that had transformed in the space of 90 seconds from a diagram of certain victory into a screaming red wall of contact icons pouring out from behind the system's gas giant, felt the floor of 11,000 years of Dominion military doctrine begin, quite literally, to fall away beneath him. "That is not possible," he said to no one, to the smoke, to the alarms. "There is nothing behind that gas giant. There was nothing on the surveys." "Marshal," Corps said, and her voice now had the particular flatness of an officer who has stopped hoping the numbers will improve and started simply reporting them. "Long-range sensors are picking up 60-plus additional hostile capital contacts emerging from the gas giant's magnetosphere. Drone swarm density is, Marshal, we cannot get a clean count. The swarm is jamming our targeting radar just by sheer contact volume." The Valorian battlecruisers, still holding their crown formation out of pure institutional muscle memory, began to open fire on the incoming drone swarm with point defense batteries designed to knock down a handful of missiles per engagement. And it was, in the flattest possible sense, not enough. For every 11 drones, a battlecruiser's defense grid managed to burn out of the sky. 40 more slipped through the gaps, and those that slipped through did not carry warheads sized to threaten a battlecruiser's main armor. They didn't need to. They carried shaped charge penetrators designed for a single purpose: burrow through point defense turret housings, sensor arrays, and engine intake shielding, the soft, unarmored places on an otherwise heavily plated warship, the places nobody had ever needed to reinforce in 11,000 years, because nobody had ever thrown 11,000 cheap suicidal drones at a Dominion hull all at once. Within 4 minutes, the battlecruiser Talon of Ring Kai had lost every point defense turret on its dorsal hull, blind and half-deaf, still enormous and still armored, and still functionally unable to stop what came next. What came next was the 9th Colonial Response Fleet's second wave. 9 cruiser hulls of a design the Dominion had never seen and would not survive to properly catalog, built around a single devastating weapon system that human engineers called, with characteristic bluntness, the Cerberus Lance, a nuclear-pumped X-ray laser array. One shot, single use, each cruiser carrying a magazine of 48 preloaded lasing rods arranged in a radial cluster around a hardened fission core. When a Cerberus cruiser fired, it did not fire a beam so much as detonate a small, precisely directed nuclear weapon whose energy was captured and focused, in the nanoseconds before the detonation destroyed the rod itself, into a coherent lance of X-ray radiation capable of punching through kilometers of the densest armor the Dominion had ever built. Because there was no practical way to armor against a weapon that converted the entire output of a nuclear detonation into a single directed line. The Talon of Ring Kai, blind, deaf, and already bleeding atmosphere from 40 drone strikes, took a single Cerberus lance directly amidships and simply ceased in any meaningful sense to be a warship. The lance did not merely breach the hull. It cooked the ship's internal structure from bow to stern in a fraction of a second, superheating decking, weapons, stores, and crew alike, and the vessel that had been, 90 seconds earlier, a 3-kilometer symbol of Dominion power, drifted onward as a slowly tumbling coffin, its reactor core beginning the long, unstoppable cascade toward critical failure. On the bridge of the ashes of Kelmer, Threxus Vol watched the Talon die on his tactical plot and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific cold horror of a man who has just understood that everything he was taught to believe about his enemy was not merely wrong, but had been engineered to be wrong on purpose by people patient enough to wait years for exactly this moment. "Belay the ground bombardment," he said, and his voice, to his own disgust, was not steady. "Belay it. Concentrate all fire on the emerging capital contacts I want." "Marshal, the orbital platforms are firing again," Kor cut in, and for the first time in her career she did not wait for permission to interrupt him, because there was no longer time for the niceties of Dominion command hierarchy. "Rail Platform 3 has our position. Brace for." The second railgun volley took the ashes of Kelmer across its already wounded midsection, and this time the impact did not merely stagger the ship. It severed it. The dreadnought's aft two-thirds, containing its primary drive core, sheared away from the forward command structure in a spray of molten hull plating and vented reactor coolant, and the entire vessel, 6 kilometers of the Dominion's pride, began the slow, terrible process of coming apart along a wound no armor plating on any Valorian ship had ever been designed to survive. Because no engineer in 11,000 years of unbroken Dominion victories had ever needed to imagine an enemy capable of inflicting it. Threxus Vol was thrown from his command throne, restraints tearing, and landed hard against a bulkhead already warm from fires burning 3 decks below. Around him, the bridge crew who were not already dead were screaming into comm channels that connected to ships that, in many cases, no longer existed to receive the transmissions. Through the cracked viewport, past the smoke curling from a ruptured environmental duct, he could see, with perfect and unwelcome clarity, the battle unfolding across the system. And it was not a battle in any sense he recognized. It was a slaughter, and the Dominion was not the one doing the slaughtering. The human fleet had not engaged in a straight-line brawl at all. Admiral Osai's doctrine, refined across 3 wars and 6 years of simulation against exactly this kind of numerically superior, doctrinally rigid opponent, called for what her staff privately referred to as peeling, isolating individual capital ships from the crowd's mutual support by flooding the space around them with drone contacts too dense for point defense to clear, then finishing the blinded, wounded hull with a precision Cerberus strike before moving the drone swarm's attention to the next target. It was surgical. It was patient. It treated 400 warships not as an overwhelming force to be met head-on, but as 400 individual problems to be solved one at a time, at a pace the Dominion's own centralized command structure, every order still rooted up through Threxus Val's flagship for approval, per 11,000 years of doctrine, simply could not keep up with. Marshall, a junior officer, half his face burned, dragged himself across the canted deck toward what remained of the command station. Orders, we need orders. Half the fleet doesn't know if we're withdrawing or holding position. The comm relay is. Even as the ashes of Kelmer bled atmosphere and light into the dark, the wider engagement continued to unfold with a mechanical, unhurried precision that no Dominion officer in that system would ever fully stop replaying in his mind. Admiral Osai's doctrine did not call for her capital ships to close to knife range and trade broadsides, the way Dominion battle doctrine assumed any serious engagement eventually must. It called for range, patience, and layered attrition, the kind of fight that looked, from the outside, almost slow, and was in fact the fastest possible way to dismantle a numerically superior enemy without ever giving that enemy the chance to bring its full weight to bear at once. The 9 Cerberus pattern cruisers held station at extreme range, well outside the effective envelope of the Dominion's graviton cannons, protected from direct engagement by an escort screen of frigates whose sole purpose was to shepherd the drone swarm and keep enemy contacts blind long enough for the lasing rods to find their targets. Every Cerberus strike came at a cost. Each cruiser carried only 48 rods, and Osai's staff had gamed the math of that scarcity for 6 years, which was precisely why the fleet's opening moves had not been a wasteful barrage but a coordinated, surgical picking apart of exactly the ships whose loss would cripple Dominion coordination fastest. Point defense CR. UOISers, sensor pickets, and anything flying a command and control signature, so that within the first 10 minutes of general engagement, more than a third of the Armada's midline escorts had gone dark or dead, and the survivors were already fighting half-blind. Meanwhile, the railgun platforms in high orbit above Meridian's rest, no longer needing to preserve the element of surprise, had shifted from single precision strikes to a rolling barrage pattern, each of the 6 platforms firing on a staggered 30-second recharge cycle, so that the Dominion fleet's point defense net, already saturated by drones, now also had to contend with a kinetic slug arriving from a different vector roughly every 5 seconds. There was no meaningful way to shield against it. Dominion shield technology, built across 11,000 years to disperse energy weapons and low-velocity kinetic threats, simply had no answer for a depleted matter slug moving at 9% of light speed. The shields flared, strained, and were punched through as though they were not there at all, because in any practical sense, against that weapon, they weren't. Battlecruiser captains who understood this, and there were a handful who worked it out in time, broke formation and began evasive spiraling patterns, sacrificing formation cohesion for survival, and it was precisely those captains, the ones willing to abandon 11,000 years of parade formation doctrine in the first 90 seconds of contact, who accounted for nearly all of the Dominion vessels that survived long enough to receive Sub-Marshal Corps' eventual ceasefire order. The drone swarm itself, meanwhile, was doing something no Dominion officer aboard any surviving hull could yet properly articulate, because they did not have the vocabulary for it. It was not attacking randomly. It was not even, strictly, 11,000 individual weapons. It was a single distributed intelligence wearing 11,000 small, disposable bodies, constantly reweighting its own target priority based on which Dominion hulls showed the earliest signs of losing point defense coverage, concentrating overwhelming local density against exactly those ships, and thinning its presence around hulls still capable of putting up an effective screen, so that from the outside, the swarm seemed to flow like liquid finding the lowest point in a landscape, pooling wherever resistance was weakest and draining away from wherever it was strong. A Valorian tactical officer aboard the battle cruiser Second Providence, watching this pattern resolve on his own scopes in the minutes before a Cerberus lance found his ship's engineering section, would later describe it in his final log transmission, recovered, eventually, from the wreck by a human salvage crew, as watching water find every crack in a dam at once, and understanding, for the first time, that the dam had never been built to hold. Threxus Vall, Fleet Marshal of the 17th Armada, first blade of 11,000 years of Dominion military tradition, looked at the tactical plot one more time and understood, in the space of a single breath, the actual shape of the trap that had been built for him. It was not simply that the humans had hidden a fleet behind a gas giant. It was that every single piece of intelligence his survey drones had gathered, the undefended comm towers, the shabby government building, the frightened governor, the civilian shipyard, the entire performance of a Class 5 minimal threat too weak and too foolish to resist, had been constructed deliberately, layer upon layer over years, specifically to produce this exact moment. A Dominion commander so confident in his own species' history of unbroken victory that he would walk his entire armada into a kill box without a single moment of proper caution. "All ships," he croaked into the one comm channel still functioning, "disengage. Disengage and regroup at the system's outer marker, full retreat. I say again, full." He did not get to finish the order, because the ashes of Kelmer's aft section, which had been drifting, unpowered, for the better part of a minute, finally reached the point where its damaged reactor containment could no longer hold, and the resulting detonation took the forward command structure, and Fleet Marshal Threxus Vall, with it, in a flash of white light that for one instant outshone the system's own sun. In the final seconds before the reactor breach took the forward command structure with it, Threxus Vall experienced something no amount of war college training had ever prepared him to recognize in himself, because 11,000 years of Dominion victories had simply never required a fleet marshal to feel it. The specific, vertiginous horror of a man who understands, all at once and far too late, that the story he has spent his entire career believing about his own inevitability was never true, and had perhaps never been true even for the 11,000 years of conquests that came before him, each one merely the record of an opponent who had not yet learned to hide, to wait, and to strike only once the arrogance of its enemy had done half the work of victory already. He thought, in that last compressed fragment of a second, of the intelligence report he had signed off on without a second glance, Class 5 minimal threat, and of how easily, how comfortably, he had let a single line of classification text stand in for 6 years of a species' patient, deliberate work, and he understood that this was not merely his failure alone, but the failure baked into every crown formation, every parade ground doctrine, every war college lecture that had taught Dominion officers to measure a threat by the size of the fleet it could visibly muster rather than the size of the fleet it might be capable of hiding. It was, in the end, a very small thought to have in the last second of a very long life. And then the light took it, and him, and the question of whether he might have done anything differently, and there was only the flash, and the silence after. Command of the shattered 17th Armada fell, by default, and by the grim mathematics of who was still alive to answer a hail, to Submarshal Edith Corps, aboard the battle cruiser Iron Reverence, 400 kilometers off the ashes of Kelmer's final position, watching her fleet marshal's flagship become a new, expanding star in the middle of what had, 90 minutes earlier, been the single largest offensive formation the Dominion had fielded in over a century. Corps was not a stupid woman. She had graduated top of her class at the Dominion War College on Kelmer Prime, and she understood, watching the plot resolve around her, exactly what the numbers were telling her, even before her own censor officers finished reporting them out loud. Of the 412 ships that had entered the system with such perfect, contemptuous confidence, censor returns now showed 161 confirmed destroyed, a further 94 critically disabled and drifting, weapons offline, point defense stripped bare by drone saturation, waiting only for a Cerberus lance or a follow-up railgun volley to finish what the first hour of battle had started. The rest, what remained of the battlecruiser line and the still largely intact troop transports, whose thin hulls made them catastrophically vulnerable to even a single drone strike near their crew decks, were scattered, disorganized, and for the first time in the collective memory of every officer currently breathing on those bridges, entirely without a coherent plan, because the plan had always simply been: the enemy surrenders or the enemy dies, and no contingency had ever been built for an enemy who did neither and instead calmly, methodically, took the fleet apart piece by piece from a position it had never even been detected occupying. Submarshal, her own tactical officer, a young man named Vethais whose voice had not stopped shaking since the ashes of Kelmer's reactor breach, looked up from his station with an expression she recognized because she suspected it mirrored her own. New contact resolving from the human formation. Single vessel, breaking from their main line, no weapons signature, transmitting on an open hailing frequency. On the Kestrel's bow, Admiral Renata Osei watched the tactical plot with the same flat, unhurried attention she had given it 90 minutes earlier, when the Dominion fleet had still believed itself invincible. Around her, the flag bridge crew worked their stations with the quiet, economical movements of professionals executing a plan that had, so far, unfolded within a margin of error so small it barely qualified as a surprise. She had lost 4 ships. 4 against a fleet more than 6 times the size of her own, that had arrived believing this world could not resist a single hour of bombardment. She allowed herself, briefly, to think of the crews of those 4 ships, because she had found over 3 wars that a commander who stopped feeling the weight of her own losses stopped being someone worth following. And then she set the thought carefully aside, because the battle was not yet finished, and the finishing of it mattered as much as the winning of it. They're transmitting a general retreat order across what's left of their formation, Brandt reported from the sensor station. And Admiral, we're picking up a new hail. Direct to this ship. It's the Dominion Submarshal. She's requesting a ceasefire to discuss terms. Osei allowed herself the smallest exhale, not quite a sigh. Cut engines on the pursuit squadrons. Hold position at engagement range. Weapons hot, but hold fire. She straightened from the tactical rail and smoothed the front of her uniform jacket, a habit older than the war itself. Opened the channel. Edith Corps' face resolved on the main display, a Valorian officer with a torn collar, a bleeding graze along one man. Dibble and eyes that had, in the space of 90 minutes, lost every certainty they had walked into the system carrying. She had prepared, on the short flight across to a working comm relay, a version of this conversation that preserved some shred of Dominion dignity, some framing in which this was a tactical repositioning rather than what it plainly, nakedly was. Looking now at the calm, unhurried woman on the other end of the channel, a woman who had, 90 minutes ago, commanded a fleet corps' own intelligence had rated as non-existent. She found that every version of that speech had evaporated somewhere between the ashes of Kelmer's death and this moment, and what came out instead was simply the truth. "Admiral," Kor said, and the honorific cost her something to use, because it was an acknowledgement that the woman on the other side of the channel commanded a fleet, a real one, the kind the Dominion's own intelligence assessment had sworn did not exist. "I am Sub-Marshal Edith Kor, ranking officer of what remains of the 17th Armada. I am requesting an immediate ceasefire to allow for the recovery of survivors from our disabled and destroyed vessels." "Granted," Osai said, without hesitation, and something in Kor's expression shifted, a flicker of confusion at the speed and simplicity of the answer, as though she had braced for negotiation and found none waiting. "My search and rescue craft are already moving to assist with recovery from your drifting hulls, Sub-Marshal. We are not interested in killing men and women who are no longer capable of fighting. We were never interested in that. We were interested in making sure your fleet understood, in terms it could not later dismiss as exaggeration, precisely what it costs to treat this colony, or any human world, as an easy meal." Kor's jaw tightened. "You allowed us to believe this world was undefended." "You believed what your own arrogance told you to believe," Osei said, and there was no cruelty in her voice, only a flat, patient correction, the tone of a teacher marking a fatal error on an exam. "We hid the platforms. We hid the fleet. We did not hide the fact that a species who has survived 2 prior first-contact wars against empires larger than yours might reasonably be expected to plan for a third. That information was available to anyone willing to look at us as something other than a Class 5 checkbox to be ticked off before lunch." On the Iron Reverence, Kor looked past the display, at her own tactical plot, at the wreckage of 161 Dominion warships tumbling in slow, silent arcs against the gas giant's amber clouds, at the 94 crippled hulls whose crews were, even now, watching human rescue shuttles approach with an expression she suspected was closer to disbelief than gratitude. And she understood with the particular clarity that only total, comprehensive defeat can provide, that there was no version of the report she would eventually have to file back to Dominion High Command that would not end her career, and no version of the war that continued from this point that would not simply produce more of what had just happened in this system, over and over. For as long as the Dominion continued to underestimate a species, it had never bothered to properly understand, and had paid for that failure of imagination in hulls, in crews, and in the quiet, permanent end of an 11,000-year story the Dominion had once believed could never end at all. "What are your terms?" Kor said, and the question came out flatter than she intended, stripped of the formal diplomatic phrasing the War College had drilled into her, because there was nothing left in her to dress the moment up in dignity it no longer possessed. "Full and immediate surrender of all combat-capable vessels remaining in this system," Osei said. "Your wounded will be treated by our medical teams alongside our own casualties, without distinction. Your surviving crews will be permitted safe transit home aboard your own transport vessels, unarmed, once we have confirmed all weapon systems have been disabled and verified. We are not interested in Dominion territory. We are not interested in Dominion prisoners beyond what basic decency requires for the wounded. We want exactly one thing from this engagement, Sub-Marshal, and it is not your surrender documents." "Then what," Kor said, "do you want?" "We want it understood, clearly, permanently, by every officer who survives to report on this system, that Meridian's rest was not an anomaly," Osei said. "That this was not luck, or a single desperate gambit that happened to succeed. It was doctrine. It is what happens to any force of any size that approaches a human world assuming it has already won before the first shot is fired. We want the Dominion to go home and tell every neighboring power exactly what they saw here today, in exact and humiliating detail, so that the next commander who considers Doi And gee, what Fleet Marshal Val did this morning thinks, for just one moment longer than he otherwise would have, about whether the intelligence report in front of him might be a story someone wrote for him to believe. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Brant, at the sensor station, glanced up to check the channel hadn't dropped. It hadn't. Eth Kor simply sat with the words for a long moment, because there was nothing in 11,000 years of Dominion military doctrine that had prepared her to be handed a demand that cost her empire nothing in territory, and everything in the one currency the Dominion had never before had reason to spend: its reputation for inevitability. "I will relay your terms to what remains of my command," Kor said finally. "I do not have the authority to surrender the Armada's flag. That authority died with Fleet Marshal Val." "Then find whoever does have it quickly," Osei said, not unkindly. "Because 94 of your ships are currently drifting with catastrophic hull breaches and failing life support, Sub-Marshal, and every hour your command spends deciding who gets to sign a piece of paper is an hour more of your people we could be pulling out of the wreckage instead of arguing about protocol. We are not your enemy anymore, not in this conversation. Right now, we are the only people in this system with functioning rescue craft, and I would very much like to start using them." It took 11 minutes during which every disabled Dominion hull in the system broadcast the same open, desperate telemetry: life support failing, hull integrity dropping past survivable thresholds, crews with no working shuttles and a rapidly closing window. For Eth Kor to reach the fleet's ranking surviving flag officer, a battle cruiser captain named Dorun Faith, who had never expected, in 100 years of Dominion service, to be the one making this particular call, and who made it in less time than it had taken Osei's rescue shuttles to reach the first crippled hull. "Authorize it," Faith said over the emergency channel, his voice cracked with something between exhaustion and relief. "Authorize the surrender, all remaining combat vessels, full compliance with human recovery operations. Tell them to save my people first and argue about the paperwork after." In the hours between Faith's authorization and the first human shuttle making contact with a Dominion hull, the true scale of the wreckage field became visible in a way that the fast, chaotic minutes of battle had never allowed anyone to properly absorb. It stretched across nearly 200,000 kilometers of space, a slow-drifting graveyard lit by the system's yellow sun and by the guttering fires still burning in a dozen hulls whose atmosphere had not yet fully vented. Battlecruisers 3 kilometers long, tumbling end over end with their spines cracked open like old fruit, their once perfect crown formation reduced to a scattered field of debris that from a distance looked almost peaceful, silver and slow. If you did not know what each drifting fragment had cost, the ashes of Kelmer's forward hull, or what remained of it, hung nearly motionless at the field's center, a 6-kilometer monument to the exact moment the Dominion's confidence had run out, its one-sprowed prow crumpled inward where the second railgun volley had found it, its running lights long since gone dark. Troop transports, their thin hulls having fared far worse than the armored battle cruisers, accounted for a disproportionate share of the dead. Vessels built to move 2 million soldiers efficiently from one already secured world to the next had never been built to survive a drone strike near their crew decks, and more than one surviving Valorian soldier would spend the rest of his life unable to stop hearing, in quiet moments, the particular sound a transport's hull made in its last seconds. A sound none of them had a word for in any Dominion language, because no Dominion soldier had ever needed one before. What followed was not, in the end, the humiliating parade of broken warships that popular imagination might have painted, the kind of scene the Dominion's own propaganda had staged after 100 other victories over 100 other species. Captured vessels dragged in chains behind a triumphant fleet, prisoners marched in shackles before cheering crowds. Admiral Osa had specifically forbidden any such theater, and her reasoning, laid out to her staff in the earliest planning sessions 6 years before a single Dominion ship had ever entered the system, had been simple: Humiliation you inflict on a defeated enemy is humiliation that enemy remembers forever and eventually returns, with interest, once it rebuilds. What she wanted instead was something colder and, in its own way, far more effective: competence, precision, and mercy, extended with total consistency, so that when the survivors of the 17th Armada eventually made it home, the story they told was not one of cruelty they could rally future soldiers to avenge, but one of a species that had outthought them completely and then, having won, simply declined to gloat. Human rescue shuttles moved methodically through the wreckage field for the better part of 2 days, pulling burned and freezing Valorian crew from hulls that had, 90 minutes earlier, been part of the most confident invasion force the Dominion had fielded in a century. Medical teams aboard the Kestrel's Val and 3 sister carriers worked without distinction between human and Valorian wounded, a fact that more than one shell-shocked Dominion soldier, lying on a gurney beside a human crewman with equally severe burns, found impossible to reconcile with everything he had been taught about the barbarism of the species he had come to conquer. Combat drones, their offensive payloads long since spent, were repurposed to assist salvage crews in cutting survivors free from collapsed decking, their same small, efficient bodies that had shredded the Dominion's point defense grids now serving as patient, tireless rescue tools. And there was something in that transformation, weapon to lifeline, without a single line of code needing to change, that Eoth core. Standing at the observation port of the Iron Reverence as the last of her crew were ferried across to human medical bays, found she could not stop thinking about. Governor Quaim Ape, once the shooting stopped, made planetfall requests to speak personally with the surviving Dominion command staff, and Admiral Os, after some consideration, allowed it, provided the conversation happened under her own security escort and in full view of both fleets' recording systems, because she wanted no ambiguity later about anything that was said. He met Dorun Faith, now, by grim inheritance, the ranking Dominion officer in the system, in a small conference room aboard the Kestrel's Val, the same room where, less than 3 days earlier, colony administrators had rehearsed the frightened, pleading tone Ape had used in his first transmission to Threxus Vol. "I want you to understand something, Captain Faith," Ape said, once the formal exchange of surrender documentation had concluded, "because I do not think your intelligence reports will capture it properly, and I think it matters that someone tells you plainly, human to Valorian, rather than fleet to fleet. We did not do this because we hate your people. Most of us had never heard the word Valorian before your fleet appeared in our sky 3 days ago. We built this trap, the platforms, the fleet behind Threshold, 6 years of 100,000 people going about their lives, pretending to be exactly as helpless as your survey drones told you we were, because we have learned, the hard way, twice before, what happens to a human colony that looks weak to someone who arrives assuming weakness. We are not the aggressors here, Captain. We have never once sent a fleet into someone else's system uninvited. But we have decided, as a species, that we would rather spend 6 years and a great deal of money and a great deal of patience proving to anyone who comes looking for an easy conquest that there is no such thing as an easy human world, than spend those same years hoping that the next empire to find us will be a kinder one than the last 2 were." Faith, still bearing the burns and the exhaustion of a battle he had never expected to survive, let alone command the aftermath of, listened to this with the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the balance of power in this quadrant of the galaxy. "Your Class 5 designation," he said finally. "Your entire intelligence profile. It was constructed, all of it." "Every word," Ape said. "The comm towers, the shipyard registry, the bombing pattern your survey drones logged from our mining operations, calibrated specifically to look like the kind of low-tech industrial output that wouldn't support a real defense fleet. Even the tone of my first message to Fleet Marshal Vol, I have given that speech, or one very like it, in simulation, more times than I can count. We know exactly what a frightened, helpless colonial governor is supposed to sound like when a battle fleet appears in his sky, because we have made very sure to sound like one before, every single time, right up until it was no longer useful for your marshal to believe it. There was a long silence in the small conference room, and then Faith said, quietly, the words costing him something he could not fully name, "How many of you are there in truth? Behind how many other gas giants, in how many other systems we have already surveyed and quietly dismissed?" Ape considered the question for a long moment and then gave the only honest answer he had. "I don't know, Captain. That's rather the point. Neither do you." The formal terms of surrender, finalized 4 days after the battle's opening shots, were transmitted to Dominion High Command along with full sensor recordings of the engagement. OS had insisted on this, over the objections of several of her own staff who worried about revealing tactical details to a still formidable enemy, because she wanted there to be no possibility of the story being softened or disbelieved in the retelling. She wanted every officer in the Dominion's War College to watch, in exact and unforgiving detail, precisely how 161 warships and a fleet marshal with 11,000 years of institutional confidence behind him had been dismantled by a colony intelligence had rated a Class 5 minimal threat. She wanted the lesson taught so thoroughly that it would never need repeating. It did not need repeating. Within a standard year, the engagement at Meridian's Rest, which human military historians would eventually simply call the Threshold Ambush, in the flat, unglamorous style humans seemed to favor for their own most consequential victories, had become required study not only within the Dominion's own war colleges, where Threxus Val's name was quietly struck from the honor rolls his predecessors had spent centuries filling, but across a dozen neighboring powers who had, until that battle, held their own casual assumptions about the harmlessness of the small, fractious, technologically inconsistent species scattered across a handful of remote systems on the galaxy's edge. Diplomatic overtures that had once arrived from larger empires in the tone of a landlord addressing a tenant began arriving, in the months that followed, in a noticeably more careful register. Survey drones that had once skimmed past human colonies with the barest cursory sensor sweep began lingering, cautious, thorough, unwilling any longer to trust a quiet system and an undefended-looking transmitter at face value. Admiral Renata Osai did not attend the ceremony held on Meridian's Rest 6 months later to commemorate the battle, because she had already moved the 9th Colonial Response Fleet to a new station, behind a different unremarkable gas giant, in a different quiet system on the edge of human space, because she understood, better than almost anyone in the sector, that the trap that had worked once would need to work again, somewhere else, against someone else, before the lesson truly took. She stood instead on the flag bridge of a new ship, watching a new tactical plot, in a system whose name meant nothing yet to any hostile intelligence codex anywhere in the galaxy, and she thought briefly of Eth Kor's face in that first hailing channel, the specific look of a competent, well-trained officer discovering, in real time, that everything she had been taught about her enemy was a story someone else had chosen to let her believe. It was not cruelty, Os told herself, the way she had told her staff, the way she would eventually tell the historians who came asking for interviews she mostly declined. It was simply the truth of what it cost to be underestimated by people who had never once had to consider that being underestimated might be a weapon in its own right, sharpened patiently over years, and unsheathed only once, at exactly the moment it would do the most good. The galaxy had spent a long time assuming humanity was small, and scattered, and manageable, a Class 5 curiosity to be annexed at leisure, whenever a larger power finally got around to it. After Meridian's Rest, after the wreckage field behind Threshold's amber clouds, after Eth Kor's report reached every war college within 500 light-years carrying gun camera footage of a dreadnought coming apart along a wound, no one had thought to armor against. That assumption did not survive contact with the truth. Humanity had never wanted the galaxy to fear it. What humanity had wanted all along, buried under 6 years of patient deception, and 100,000 ordinary colonists playing the part of the frightened and the helpless, was simply to never again have to fight a war it hadn't already spent years quietly preparing to win. Fear, in the end, was only the shadow that preparation cast when someone finally saw it clearly for the first time. And by the time the Valorian Dominion saw it, standing amid the wreckage of the largest invasion fleet it had launched in a century, the shadow was already the only thing left standing in that system that had not been humbled, dismantled, or quietly, permanently, taught to look twice before it ever underestimated a colony's silence again. On the bridge of that new flagship, a young tactical officer who had joined the Ninth only 8 months earlier, too late to have stood watch behind threshold during the long years of waiting, asked Os once, quietly, during a lull in the evening watch rotation, whether she ever worried that the next enemy might simply learn the lesson too well, might arrive already assuming a trap, already. A die refusing to underestimate a quiet system, and force the fight into open ground where numbers and mass would matter again, in exactly the way the Dominion's doctrine had always assumed they should. I considered the question for a long moment, the way she considered most questions worth answering honestly, and told him that she hoped someday that would happen, that an enemy would arrive cautious, respectful, unwilling to gamble an entire fleet on a single arrogant assumption, because a galaxy full of powers that no longer underestimated humanity was a galaxy in which humanity would rarely need to fight at all. The trap behind threshold, she reminded him, had never been built because anyone wanted a war. It had been built because 2 previous wars had taught a hard, small species scattered across a handful of remote systems that the only reliable way to avoid a third was to make absolutely certain the cost of starting one was catalogued, in unforgettable detail, by anyone foolish enough to try. Fear, properly built, was not a threat. It was a kind of peace, purchased in advance, at a price no one but the species paying it would ever fully understand. Far beyond the wreckage field, in the calm dark between systems, the Ninth Colonial Response Fleet settled into its new hiding place behind a new gas giant, powered down its reactors to the same patient, radiation-shrouded silence it had held for 6 years before, and waited, the way it always waited, for whoever came next to make the same mistake, so that the answer, when it finally came, could once again arrive not as a warning shouted across the void, but as a lesson delivered precisely in full. Only once it was already far too late to matter.